Welcome to Edelberg's perspective on the healthcare revenue cycle industry.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are and when you're listening. My name is Carol Edelberg, and I'm chairman and founder of Edelberg and Associates. We are a long-time revenue cycle company in medical specialties, and we probably work with 20 to 30 different medical specialties and subspecialties. And we focus primarily on coding, auditing, legal support, and documentation training for providers. With me today are two new friends and business associates, Saurabh and Shika from Combine Health AI. And as some of you may already guess, one of the biggest priorities those of us that working in medical practice and revenue cycle are dealing with, obviously, is where does artificial intelligence fit in our day-to-day management and our day-to-day technology and processes. And we happen to have two of the best experts that I've ever met working with us to help us navigate through these challenges. Saurabh, can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you think this is going?
Thanks a lot, Carol. Very excited to be here and very excited to partner with you and others at Edelberg and Associates. Just to give a little brief intro about me. So I have been an AI or a machine learning engineer for the last 10 years. I have worked with like several companies across different domains. I was at Goldman Sachs making machine learning models for finance. I was at Mercedes and Bosch making self-driving cars, uh, which can drive autonomously without any human drivers. And I also did a fitness startup where we were essentially using artificial intelligence to understand motions of a user and effectively act as their personal trainer. This was especially like during the time of COVID when gyms and other fitness facilities were not accessible. So over the last decade, I was like very interested in the applications of AI, and healthcare has always been like close to my hearts. And I was always looking for opportunities on how we can combine the two, how we can use AI to fix the problems which we see in healthcare today, especially specifically in the field of healthcare administration, and ensure that providers and hospital systems get paid what they deserve. So we are very excited, and I would love to introduce my co-founder Shika here. Shika.
Thanks, Saurabh, and lovely to be doing this with you, Carol. So yeah, I mean, a really brief introduction about myself. I myself have spent like close to the past few years in the finance space, first in a bank and then in the venture capital industry. And as Saurabh mentioned, we were looking for a space where we could apply AI and where it makes sense. And that's when we came across the healthcare admin space. And very fortunate also to be partnering with Edelberg and Associates. So yeah, I mean, I would we would obviously have a lot more to talk about AI in general, but I would love to first pass over this mic to Carol and ask her what got her interested. And yeah.
Well, thank you. I have a very interesting story, at least I think it's very interesting. And I happen to be here in Las Vegas, Nevada at the American College of Emergency Medicine Scientific Assembly. I think this is probably my 49th to 51st scientific assembly. I can't recall. As we get older, I think our memory starts to go. But I'm here seeing so many wonderful old friends and trying to share ideas about where emergency medicine is going to go from here. And there's been some incredible lectures and discussions among those of us that are running into each other in the hallway. What are you doing? What are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? And I have to tell you, along with boarding patients in our ERs again, and along with how are we going to staff our ERs again, we are all talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about artificial intelligence as it relates to our practice in the emergency department. We're talking about artificial intelligence as it relates to revenue cycle, coding, billing, dealing with denials, as many of us are dealing with just voluminous stacks of denials coming in from these payers that just don't want to pay for emergency medicine. And I always approach situations like this by going back to the beginning. Where did we start? Why are we here? How did we get here? And with all of that in mind, what's the best movement forward? How do we go forward? So I want to talk a little bit about the past. And for some of you that are a little bit younger than me, and probably most of you are, I think it's important to know how we got here. And there are names that you will hear from me that you may not hear. And to me, these people are monuments. They're incredible models, role models. They're heroes, if you want to call them that. And they're people who started in the practice of emergency medicine before there was a specialty of emergency medicine. There are men and women who saw a need and stepped out to fill it. The first one that comes to my mind is James Mills. And James Mills and some of his colleagues, physician colleagues, first ventured into emergency practice in 1961. Now, I was still in high school, so Dr. Mills was a little older than I was, but Dr. Mills in 1961 saw a need. My introduction to emergency medicine was as a high school student. And I know some of you are going to smile and say, well, now, how is this relevant? But to me, it's very relevant. We had been at a high school football game. We won, I want to add. We won the state championship or the whatever it was. And the opposing team got real upset about that. And being the nerd that I was in the band bus. And the opposing team sent a bunch of thugs over to start throwing rocks and bottles and break out windows. Some of my friends got hurt pretty bad. Some of our football players got hurt pretty bad. And we ended up downtown Miami at Jackson Memorial Hospital, which I believe now is a level 1 trauma center, one of the best in the country. But in those days, emergency medicine wasn't a big thing. And I'll tell you more about that as we move along. That night, I sat in an emergency room. I was a junior, senior in high school. And I remember sitting and looking across the emergency room, and it was called an emergency room at the time, which is to me a curse word. But the gentleman was sitting there. He was a homeless gentleman, and I could tell by his looks. And someone had gouged out one of his eyes with the end of a spoon. Probably a battle, a fight over something, who knows. And the gentleman had been sitting there, I don't know how long, but the blood had clotted down his face and was clotted down, dripping off of his chin. I know this is horrendous for those of you that don't have a clinical background. And for me as a young woman, it terrified me. The sad part was that some of my friends had been cut up pretty bad and had some pretty bad head trauma. And to me, it was pretty bad head trauma. They were bleeding very badly. Some of them were knocked senseless. And we sat there for a number of hours. And I sat and watched that gentleman, and I sat and wondered why nobody came out to help him. And I sat from about 11 o'clock at night until about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning and wondered why no one came to help him, and wondered why my friends who were bleeding pretty profusely from head wounds were still sitting there, wondering why nobody had come to help them. Eventually, someone came. Everybody got stitched up. The gentleman went down the hall to who knows where. And that was my night. But it resonated with me for years. And as I became a writer, and that was my dream to become a writer, I was asked by an emergency physician who I was working part-time for to feed the kids, because writing certainly wasn't a very lucrative revenue generator. I began to work for an emergency physician, one of the first, who actually ran a real emergency department, and began to edit some textbooks for him that he was writing and picking up and from conferences that they were given. And I became so fascinated with it that I ended up becoming a practice manager. Now, while I was doing all of that crazy stuff, there were some physicians across the country who were making a difference. Emergency departments, emergency rooms were staffed often by medical staff who each had to work a night in the ER every month as part of their medical staff requirement. Dr. Mills in Alexandria, Virginia, Dr. John Wiggenstein, I believe up north somewhere, Dr. John McDade, they were the first full-time groups to provide care exclusively in an ER. And so they were really moving things along. And the group that I began working with, Dr. Cliff Findice and his partners, had really picked up that concept and moved ahead with it. Dr. Mills' organization and their organization of the ER was called the Alexandria Plan. Other pioneers at the time, Dr. John McDade in Michigan, Bob Anzinger in Chicago, Bill Hake in Jacksonville, and many, many others who it would take me hours to go through the list, but they were incredible human beings and incredibly dedicated to the specialty. They followed suit. And for several years, there really wasn't any training, official training or official organization to work with them and for them to go to and share stories. And so it became sort of, let's all get together for dinner and talk about what we're doing and where we're going. There certainly were no academic training programs in emergency medicine. And somehow through all of it, some of the docs talked about triage. And triage really started in the Vietnam War. Now, there may be something called by another name, but the Vietnam War, the medics and the docs that were working over there had to basically figure out who to save, who could be saved, and who couldn't. And I'm sure they would tell you a very, very detailed and very painful story. But a lot of those concepts were introduced into emergency medicine. And it wasn't even called that. It was called emergency room care pretty much at the time. There was finally a get together in 1968, the first national meeting of emergency physicians, and 32 physicians from 18 states addressed the issues that they were dealing with in the emergency departments. And they formed the American College of Emergency Physicians. And it became now the largest specialty organization for emergency medicine. And it's always an honor and a privilege each year to come and attend these conferences and talk to people that you've known all of your adult life and learn about what people are doing to solve the problems in our society, and certainly for their medical practices. There also became the University Association for Emergency Medical Services, which is now referred to as the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine. And then in 1971, the first academic departments of emergency medicine were created at the University of Southern California and the University of Louisville. And the first emergency medicine residency program began a year after that at the University of Cincinnati, and that was in 1972. Now, as we're speaking today, this is 2024. So we now have a very long history, certainly not as long as the surgeons and family practice and some of the other specialties, but we have a long history. And it's exciting for me to remember when we celebrated our first year as a specialty, our second year as a specialty, and every year something new was introduced, something new happened, and things really evolved very quickly. In 1976, the American Board of Emergency Medicine was incorporated. And in 1979, ABM was formally recognized as a specialty board by the American Board of Medical Specialties. This is so interesting because as I walk through the halls here in Las Vegas at the Convention Center, and I see the hundreds and hundreds of young and, like me, older emergency folks. Originally, 600 emergency physicians sat for that first certification exam, and that was in February of 1980. And that was the first certification of emergency physicians by ABIM that following May. What an exciting time that was. And truly, truly, when I look back on that and I see how far we've come and how the acceptance of emergency medicine by all of the medical staff has evolved. And some of you remember the surgeons weren't really happy to share their fame and their space with emergency doctors. ED docs and facility charges were billed by most of our hospitals. And so as we began to move from medical practice to how are we going to get paid, it became very important to look at the evolution of the specialty as a business. And no one ever wanted to refer to medical practice or medical plan, medical specialty as a business. But come on, our docs had to get paid to continue doing what they were doing. Our hospitals had to get paid to pay for the docs. And originally, docs were either employed by the hospital or, in my experience, they were paid a percentage of charges. The hospitals did the billing, if you want to call it that. We were a line item on a claim form. We had no specialty designation. We didn't have our own claim forms. We were just a line item, emergency care, and a flat charge. And whatever that charge was, the group was then given whatever the negotiated percentage was. it was really interesting because in those days, we typically received about 80 to 85% of gross charges. Can you imagine? 80 to 85% of gross charges. In the late 70s, our group was asked by the hospital to do our own billing. And boy, was that an eye opener. We didn't have computers at that point. Now, somebody did. I'm sure some people were using computers, but not medical practices and not businesses that dealt with medical practices. So in the late 70s, we had to do billing on typewriters. And I was asked, remember, a former writer, I was asked to head up that little experience. And so that's how Carol Edelberg got into Revenue Cycle. I had a team. We had a lot of typewriters, and we read a medical chart that, if we were lucky, had 4 or 5 lines of documentation to tell us what was done. And we would take that information, convert it into a code, put that code on a claim form. And I noted that some of the payers didn't want to pay for that. So we learned very quickly that the payers really wanted us to be able to express how important that emergency visit was, how necessary that medical visit was, now called medical necessity. So I learned very quickly to write things like sudden and severe, copious, words like severe vomiting, copious bleeding, anything I could think of in my poor little non-medical bag of tricks to make it clear to payers that these were necessary visits and we needed to get paid. We also tried to manage missing charts. And missing charts were a big problem because back then, of course, we didn't have HIPAA and we didn't worry about privacy. And I would find stacks of medical records behind the ER refrigerator when we moved it for cleaning, because the docs would go in to get coffee, lay the charts on the refrigerator, somebody would hit the refrigerator, and lo and behold, the charts would fall behind it. There were a lot of charts found in the back seat of people's cars. There were a lot of charts found out by the waiting area. There were a lot of charts found, I don't even think we had microwaves back then, on top of the little portable oven in the emergency room. We found charts everywhere. Docs would often stack them there day after day after day after day, not thinking that there was any need for anyone else to look at them until they got around to signing them. And believe me, it was a real happy day when 50% of the charts were signed. And I share this with you because it's important for us to see how far we've come, to understand why we're going to have to go now another mile, another 10 miles, another 20 miles, another several hundred miles to move our practices and our revenue cycle organizations into where we need to be. Most of the charts couldn't be read because, you know what? They were all handwritten. And I don't know about you, but my memory of doctors' handwriting was pretty acute. And there was very big challenge trying to understand what the scribble was. Barely a paragraph, missing charts, unreadable when they were documented. It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. So needless to say, that specialty moved towards manually typed claim forms, manually typed statements, many times manually typed medical records with carbon copies. Manually managed payments. There were no lock boxes. The checks came to the office. We opened them up. We stamped them, and somebody took them to the bank every Monday. We hoped there was no wreck. We hoped there was no lost checks. Anything could happen. I remember in probably the late 70s, early 80s, one of the FedEx trucks caught on fire with all of our stuff. So anything could happen. Month-end reports, data, are you kidding? I remember thinking I was probably a real trendsetter when I started typing up month-end reports for my doctors, simply telling them how much we billed for them, broke it down by payer. That was important. We had financial classes because I wanted to know, I wanted to be able at some point to track what percentage of our charges we were being paid so that I could assure my doctors that the 80% of gross guarantee they got wasn't as good as what we got, even though we might not have collected 80% of gross, but our gross was different. And because we were capturing much more of their charges and those types of things. So as we moved along, life changed. We made progress, and things smoothed out. Hospital billing didn't break out too much of the details, and nor did some of the billing companies. But then all of a sudden, something called TEFRA was introduced. Tax equity, I can't even remember what it all was. Look, you'll have to look it up, but TEFRA. And it required separate billing and separate provider numbers for providers. And this happened in the 80s. And at that point, the industry changed dramatically. And at that point, more and more organizations decided to become revenue cycle organizations and decided to formalize billing and track billing by the providers assigned to the groups. But each physician had to have their own individual provider number after TEFRA. And then the group had its own provider number working under its tax ID number. And so it began to formalize these things. The prospective payment system for inpatient hospital care using DRGs was introduced, followed by, separate tax ID numbers for everybody. And it facilitated totally separate payment for group practices and individual providers to group IDs, and individual providers had their own IDs, and we were able to track things much more clearly. And then somehow through all of this, we all got really smart almost overnight, and we decided that documentation really needed to be microscopically analyzed, because I began to understand in my practice that 3 or 4 lines couldn't possibly address everything that was done to that patient in the emergency room. My office was right across the hall, and there was a lot of screaming coming from over there. So I knew a lot of stuff was happening, and we couldn't possibly be capturing all of it. Sounds silly, sounds crazy, but it really opened my eyes to the fact that a lot was being done. And why? Why was it being done? How are we coming up with these diagnoses? Because believe me, nobody understood diagnosis coding back then. There was minimal input from the American Medical Association. And so we began to kind of take things apart. I remember the first time I walked into a teaching hospital and attempted, and I say attempted, to educate the residents on documentation. They called it grand rounds, and it made me feel very, very important. But I have to tell you, those residents were bored out of their brains. They didn't want anything to do with it. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it, because at that point, the critical need had not been identified. And so we kept trying and we kept pushing. And at some point, it caught on. Coding and payment requirements evolved and spearheaded the documentation improvements. It wasn't patient and it wasn't medical staff need. It was payment requirements that really moved us to capture more and more information. Who decides what is necessary? Who decides what is superfluous? Who does that in your practice today? I can tell you back then, it was revenue cycle. We didn't hear it from the payers. We didn't hear it from the other medical staff. And unless, of course, they decided to storm into the emergency department and accost our ER doc or one of the nurses with, why didn't we tell them A, B, C, and D? And so as it evolved as part of revenue cycle, it really began to grow as part of a medical staff requirement. So we saw documentation growing into its critical need. Today, we all know exactly what kind of documentation is needed. Physicians weren't interested, didn't want to hear it, and now they lead the charge. Docs are now receiving sophisticated education on all things revenue cycle. And thank you, Lord. We're getting so much input from the docs on what's important, what else is important, what is more important. How do we have to break these things down in order to capture not just the information for the coding, but capture the information for the resources in the emergency department? It isn't just enough for the doctor to tell us what they did. We have to know why they did it and how they did it. And that is so very important. But in the early years, again, 3 sentences was golden. Now, 20 pages really, really, really is sort of a normal day in going through a chart and trying to code it. Residencies really resisted having to do all of that extra work. And it became important for the residencies to pick that up and move ahead with it. And they did. And they did a beautiful job. Today, sophisticated education, technology can slice and dice every statement and every billable event. and provide superior support to clinical practices. And that happens by someone looking at that chart, breaking it down to the nth degree, and teaching the computer through all of its tech, individuals, the people who do all the hard work. How do we capture this? What's important, and what does it mean? Data is available to recognize the improvement in a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, down to the provider, coder, and instructor for all providers, physicians, APPs, nurses, residents, everyone. I've seen month-end stacks of reports going from 1 page to about a 6 to 12-inch high stack of month-end reports. Now everything's automated. Now we can, pull it up on our computer, find what we're looking for, match it, add it up, subtract from it, multiply it, anything that you need. But that wasn't always there. Data accuracy always was critical, and we never got it with handwritten charts. Now we can pull that information out of these charts, but it still depends on how the source documents are designed, how they're used, how the data is collected, how errors are corrected, and more is not always better. And I think any of you listening that are physicians or providers will agree, more is not always better. But the real trick is to understand when more is not better, what is better? What are the key words? What are the key phrases? What are the key elements that we need to capture? A, to track it, B, to bill it. Special needs are now a constant, and every practice that you work with has their special needs. What are they looking for? Where are they going? Where do they want to be next year? And how can we talk about any of this without talking about the payers who are creating such a tremendous issue for a revenue cycle now? Denials are multiplying by the minute. There are special teams now that deal with denials rather than a special individual. Payers now track billing data on individuals, groups, and facilities, decide what your common diagnoses are, what common diagnoses they don't need to pay, they don't feel are medically necessary, and they're denying claims based on, lack of medical necessity, when in the emergency department, we understand how critically important it is to see everyone that walks through the door and determine what is wrong and how it needs to be treated. In the face of subjective code descriptors, payers use a lot of unique criteria to pay claims. They redefine coding definitions and create roadblocks to payment. And these are things that we are going to deal with day by day, minute by minute, and have become such a tremendous weight, if you will, tremendous responsibility for revenue cycle and practices. I think you've probably heard enough for today. And I wanted to try to start over again and have you understand how we got where we are. Our next discussion, which we will be able to give you dates and times for very soon, will take you to the next section. All of these issues are important. How are we going to deal with them? Well, I think the solution of choice is artificial intelligence, lovingly known as AI. And the team that I'm working with, who you heard from here, we have chosen to work with us. We are an extremely experienced and certainly one of the larger providers of medical coding and billing in the medical coding. We outsource a lot of the billing to experts in the fields that we're managing. And so medical coding is very, very critically important to us, as is documentation improvement, education, and auditing. And I don't know how you can be in medical coding today without understanding the best ways to audit the claims that you generate, and auditing the people that you're training, et cetera. So our next segment is going to talk about how we take all of these different pieces and put them together with artificial intelligence. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for our next discussion, where we will go into, in great detail, here comes artificial intelligence and what it's going to mean to us. Hope you all have a great day, and thank you so very much for listening. We look forward to future discussions. Have a great day.